It was the summer of 1914. Europe stood at the height of its power, proud, rich, and confident. Empires stretched across continents. Kings, kaisers, and czars ruled over millions. No one could imagine that within months, the world would plunge into darkness. Crowded streets bustled in Vienna. Cafes overflowed in Paris. British soldiers marched proudly in their parade uniforms. The age of empire looked unstoppable, but the spark that would destroy it all came from a single city, Sarajevo. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, arrived in Bosnia with his wife, Sophie, as their car turned down a narrow street. A young nationalist named Gavrilo Princip stepped forward and fired 2 shots. 2 gunshots echoed. Those bullets killed the Archduke and his wife and set fire to the world. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia. Germany pledged its support to Austria. Russia promised to defend Serbia. France stood behind Russia and Britain watched, waiting but not for long. Within 1 month, Europe's great powers were at war. Kaiser Wilhelm II told his soldiers, "You will be home before the leaves fall," but the leaves would fall 4 times before it ended. Young men cheered as they left for battle. They believed it would be short, glorious, a grand adventure. In Britain, in France, in Germany, the story was the same. Patriotism drowned out fear. Posters promised honor. Songs spoke of victory. A British soldier wrote home in 1914, "We'll give the Hun a good thrashing and be home by Christmas." But Christmas came, and the soldiers were still there. By then, the Western Front had turned into a nightmare. By late 1914, the war had stalled. From the North Sea to the Swiss border, soldiers dug deep miles of trenches carved into the earth. The space between them became known as no man's land. A German soldier wrote in his diary, "We live in holes, like rats. The earth shakes day and night. We sleep beside the dead." Machine guns cut down waves of men. Artillery pounded the soil into mud. And then came the gas. Silent, invisible, deadly. At Ypres, chlorine gas burned lungs and blinded thousands. At the Marne, French and British troops stopped the German advance, but at a terrible cost. A French officer remembered, "My regiment to 1,800 strong after 2 days. We were 300 by the end of 1914. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas had already claimed over 1 million lives, and the worst was yet to come by 1915. Europe was trapped in a war no one had planned for, and no one knew how to end. Millions of soldiers now faced a new kind of hell, a war of machines, a war of mud, a war of waiting. Across the Western Front, the guns thundered day and night. But the war was spreading beyond Europe's fields, into deserts, oceans, and faraway colonies. In the spring of 1915, the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers Germany and Austria-Hungary, and suddenly, a new front opened across the Middle East. The Allies struck back where they thought the empire was weakest, Gallipoli, on the Turkish coast. It was supposed to be quick, a bold strike to open the Dardanelles and capture Constantinople. But the cliffs were steep, the defenders were ready, and the beaches ran red. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk told his men, "I am not ordering you to attack, I am ordering you to die." Under his command, the Turks held their ground. After 8 brutal months, the Allies withdrew, leaving behind more than 250,000 dead and wounded. Gallipoli was a lesson that courage alone could not defeat machine guns, barbed wire, and modern defense. By early 1916, the focus shifted back to Europe, to a small fortress city in France, Verdun. The Germans attacked with one goal, not victory, but destruction, to bleed France dry. Their commander, General Erich von Falkenhayn, declared, "We will make France bleed white." For 10 months, Verdun became a living hell. Artillery shattered forests into wastelands. Shells cratered the earth so deeply that rivers vanished underground. A French soldier wrote home, "Hell cannot be so terrible." But the French commander, Philippe Pétain, stood firm. He told his men, "They shall not pass," and they didn't. But by the time the guns fell silent, over 700,000 men were dead, wounded, or missing for just a few miles of ground. Verdun became a symbol not of victory, but of survival. To relieve the pressure on Verdun, the British and French launched another attack. The Battle of the Somme, July 1, 1916, dawn at 7:30 in the morning. The whistle blew. Tens of thousands of British soldiers climbed from their trenches and walked forward into machine gun fire. A young private later wrote, "We were told the wire would be cut. It wasn't." By nightfall, Britain had lost 57,000 men, the bloodiest day in its history. The battle raged on for months. The Allies advanced only a few kilometers. And by November, more than 1 million lives were gone. Field Marshal Haig said, "The nation must be taught to bear losses." But no nation was ready for losses like these. The war had now become total. Every factory, every farm, every family part of the front line. Women took the place of men in the factories, forging shells and building planes. In the skies, new machines roared, airplanes, zeppelins, and tanks rolled into battle. Technology promised progress but delivered death. The Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, wrote, "I am a hunter. My prey is the enemy flyer." In the air, heroes were made. On the ground, millions simply vanished. By the end of 1916, the war had devoured everything: men, empires, and hope itself. In villages from Yorkshire to Bavaria, from Warsaw to Vienna, bells tolled every week for sons who would never return. British nurse Edith Cavell said before her execution, "Patriotism is not enough. I must have no hatred or bitterness toward anyone." Her courage became a light in the darkness. 1916 ended not with victory, but exhaustion. The world stood on the edge and the storm had not yet passed. By 1917, the world was breaking apart. 3 years of war had bled Europe dry. Millions were dead. Millions more were broken in body and spirit. The soldiers still fought, but few remembered what they were fighting for. In the trenches, hope was fading. The mud, the rats, the endless shellfire. This was no longer a war for glory, it was a war for survival. Across Europe, hunger stalked the cities. In Germany and Austria, food ran short. Bread lines stretched through the streets. Children grew thin. The promise of victory seemed like a cruel joke, but in Russia, the empire itself began to crumble. For centuries, the Tsars had ruled with absolute power. Now, their armies were starving, their people exhausted, and their faith in the throne was gone. In March 1917, protests erupted in Petrograd. Workers, soldiers, and mothers demanding bread, peace, and freedom. The Tsar sent troops to crush the revolt, but the soldiers refused to fire. The Russian Revolution had begun. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne. 300 years of Romanov rule ended overnight. A new government rose, promising democracy, reform, and an end to chaos. But the war dragged on, and in the shadows, another force gathered, led by a man named Vladimir Lenin. In November 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power. Their message was simple: peace, land, and bread. Russia pulled out of the war. The Eastern Front went silent, but the chaos spread like wildfire. For the first time, a great empire had fallen, not by defeat in battle, but by the will of its own people. While Russia collapsed, new powers entered the war. Across the Atlantic, another nation stirred: the United States of America. For years, America had stayed out of the conflict. President Woodrow Wilson promised neutrality, but German submarines, U-boats were sinking civilian ships across the Atlantic. And in 1917, Britain intercepted a secret German message, the Zimmermann telegram, promising Mexico U.S. territory if it joined the war. The message shocked America, and the illusion of peace was over. In April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. American industry roared to life. Factories built weapons by the millions. Fresh troops crossed the ocean, young, untested, and full of energy. The Allies called them doughboys, and their arrival changed everything. But even as new hope arrived, the old world was dying. In France, soldiers refused to attack. Entire units mutinied, shouting, "We are not slaves, we will defend, but we will not die for nothing." In Germany, strikes broke out in the factories. Even in Britain, faith in the war began to fade. Every nation was cracking under the weight of its own suffering. New machines only made the killing worse. Massive tanks crushed barbed wire. Poison gas filled the air again, and in the skies, squadrons of planes clashed like birds of steel. The war had become a nightmare of invention. Every breakthrough only created a new way to die. By the end of 1917, Europe was a continent of ghosts. Fields once full of harvests were now graveyards. Cities trembled under bombardment, and entire generations were gone. The world had changed forever, and yet the final storm was still gathering. By 1918, the war had consumed everything. Empires stood on the edge of collapse. Kings, kaisers, and tsars who once ruled the world were now watching their nations bleed to death. For long years of horror, for winters of hunger, for summers of slaughter. And yet it was not over. Germany prepared one last gamble. With Russia out of the war, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers moved west. They hoped to crush the Allies before American forces could arrive in full strength. March 1918, the German Spring Offensive began. Thousands of guns opened fire at once, the largest bombardment the world had ever seen. Shells rained down across the Western Front. British lines shattered. German stormtroopers advanced fast and deep. For a moment, it seemed Germany might finally win. But their victories came at a terrible cost. Supplies ran out. Exhausted men marched through mud and fire, and behind them fresh American divisions were arriving every day. The tide began to turn. By the summer of 1918, the Allies struck back. British tanks rolled forward in massive numbers. French troops, rebuilt under new leadership, pushed hard, and American soldiers, the doughboys, joined the fight with unstoppable energy. At the Battle of Amiens, Allied forces smashed through German defenses. One German officer wrote, "It was the black day of the German army." In Germany, the truth could no longer be hidden. Hunger filled the cities. Protests erupted in Berlin. Sailors mutinied in the ports, refusing to fight. The empire was collapsing from within. By October, Austria-Hungary began to disintegrate. Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, new nations were born out of the ruins. The Ottoman Empire was collapsing too. In the Middle East, Arab forces rose in revolt. The old world built on crowns and colonies was crumbling to dust. In early November 1918, the German Kaiser fled into exile. His armies were starving, his people in revolution. There was nothing left to fight for, and so, on the 11th day of the 11th month, at the 11th hour, the guns finally fell silent. The armistice had been signed. The Great War was over. Silence swept across the trenches. Men who had fought for years stood staring at each other. Some wept, some cheered, some simply collapsed. They had survived the unthinkable. But the world they had known was gone forever. When peace returned, it came with pain. In 1919, the victors gathered in Paris to decide the future. The result was the Treaty of Versailles. Germany was blamed for the war and forced to accept crushing terms. Territories lost, colonies seized, reparations demanded. Many hoped this treaty would end all wars, but others feared it had only planted the seeds of the next one. By the time it was over, the numbers told a story too terrible to imagine. More than 65 million men had fought. Over 20 million were dead. Entire generations lost. Empires vanished. The map of the world had been rewritten in blood. As the guns of 1918 fell silent, a new century began, one built on grief, change, and fragile hope. The First World War had ended, but the shadow it cast would shape the world for decades to come. The guns of the Great War fell silent. But the silence was heavy. It carried the echo of millions of voices that would never be heard again. Across Europe, cities lay in ruins. Fields were scarred with trenches that stretched to the horizon. Families waited for sons who would never come home, and an entire generation was lost. The victors called it the war to end all wars, but peace proved fragile. The old empires had vanished. Germany's Kaiser, Russia's Tsar, Austria's Emperor, and the Ottoman Sultan all gone. In their place rose new nations, new borders, and new tensions that would one day ignite again. The Treaty of Versailles redrew the map, but it could not heal the wounds. In Germany, humiliation and hunger bred anger. In Russia, revolution became dictatorship, and in the hearts of many, hope turned to bitterness. The world had survived the First Global War, but it had not learned how to keep the peace. Yet from the ruins, something else began to grow. Women who had worked in factories demanded equality. Soldiers who had seen horror dreamed of unity. Writers, poets, and artists gave voice to a generation forever changed. From the ashes of destruction came movements for freedom, for democracy, for a better world. The Great War ended in 1918, but its shadow stretched across the century. Every border drawn, every revolution sparked, every lesson learned or forgotten can still be traced back to those 4 terrible years. More than 100 years later, the fields of Flanders bloom with red poppies. They remind us of what was lost and of what must never be repeated. Because history is not just about the past. It is a warning, a whisper across time, telling us to remember